Starmer edges Britain closer to China as Trump continues to threaten and destabilise. Tonight, are we watching the world order rewritten? Good evening from Beijing for a special programme on the world order and whether small steps on a British visit here are part of a much bigger global change. Keir Starmer has become the latest foreign leader to seek trade and build trust with China in the name of mutual self-interest. Beijing, it seems, has won the argument to let differences on human rights and geopolitics remain differences, whilst building a pragmatic relationship based on economics and a shared belief in the rules-based world order. For some, of course, like Canadian leader Mark Carney, that world order is already over, as great powers around the world dismantle it, not least Donald Trump, whose tariff wars, territorial threats and military action have gone hand in hand with the trashing of post-war institutions and agreements. So is Britain being pushed into seeking new relationships? You might say, has Trump made China great again?
I'm in Brussels, where the European Union is caught between an untrustworthy America and an increasingly dominant China.
And I'm in Washington, D.C., where the Trump administration is reacting to traditional allies looking east and turning to China.
The last British leader to visit here was Theresa May 8 years ago. A lot has changed since then. The UK has seen Chinese spying scandals and alleged cyber attacks. There's been Chinese alignment with Russia through the invasion of Ukraine. Then came Donald Trump and his tearing up of old alliances. And with economic growth still puny in the UK, Sir Keir Starmer thought it time to look beyond those dark days of discord. He is already trying to sell the trip as a mutual success in business terms, with UK nationals now able to visit China without visas. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
The security state has long pedigree here. Curfew drums at sundown would mean medieval gates and Hutong courtyards must be bolted shut to the outside world. Today's surveillance state is a high-tech, often brutal successor. But Keir Starmer has decided Britain can't afford to keep China at arm's length. Chinese state media said Keir Starmer was in Beijing in the hope of rescuing Britain's puny economic growth figures. His host, President Xi, was warmer in his opening remarks, praising Keir Starmer for rejecting the icy relations that recent Tory governments pursued, and, without naming Donald Trump, referring to these volatile times.
In previous years, China-UK relations went through some twists and turns. It did not serve the interests of our two countries. Right now, the world is both fluid and turbulent. In the past, Labour governments made important contributions to the growth of China-UK relations. You've publicly said that China is an opportunity and that dealing with China is not a choice, but a necessity. I commend these words.
As you have said, this is the first visit by a UK Prime Minister in 8 years. To my mind, that's been far too long. I look forward to taking our relationship further, focused on delivering growth and security for Britain. My only misgiving is that the visit is so short.
Keir Starmer boasted that his meeting with President Xi lasted longer than planned, nearly 3 hours in all, and produced real outcomes in the national interest. He said human rights issues, like the imminent sentencing in Hong Kong of British businessman Jimmy Lai, were raised.
How forcefully did you raise issues such as the jailing of the pro-democracy campaigner Jimmy Lai, the treatment of the Uyghurs, for instance?
Well, we raised those issues as you would expect. Part of the rationale for engagement is to make sure that we can both seize the opportunities that are available, which is what we've done, but also have a mature discussion about issues that we disagree on.
Were they listening on that, you think?
Yes, we did have a respectful discussion about that.
China's Prime Minister introduced Keir Starmer to a guard of honour. This is a serious adjustment to the UK's stance on China. The government's decided that China's industrial-scale espionage, its cyber attacks, its support for Russia through the Ukraine conflict, and much else should not be obstacles to improved economic ties. Number 10 said there were already tangible benefits from the new approach, including 30-day visa-free travel for British visitors to China, bringing Britain into line with countries who've kept up better relations with China, like France and Germany.
We made some really good progress on tariffs for whisky, on visa-free travel to China, and on information exchange and cooperation on irregular migration.
In the 8 years since Theresa May visited Beijing, the world order has been shaken. And a new period costume cult has seized visitors to the Forbidden City. President Trump's attacks on international order have left a number of governments thinking they need their own lines of communication to Beijing, and President Xi is doing his best to capitalise on the moment, urging America's long-standing allies to seek more autonomy.
Prime Minister, your impressions of President Xi, is he someone you can do business with?
Yes, we had a very good, productive session.
But doing business, even with warmer relations, won't extend to the giant infrastructure investment from China that Britain used to beg for. Economic gains might not look as historic as Keir Starmer would like. But right now, he'll take anything that nudges the stubborn, sticky economic dial.
Well, a little earlier, Gary joined me here. Gary, the Prime Minister says he raised Jimmy Lai and human rights, but I mean, how strongly?
Quite. It's been very clearly established for a while with China. If you want enhanced economic engagement with China, you don't go down the route of making an awful lot of noise about human rights. You bring down the volume a bit. And there have been people who've tried to play it both ways, get economic engagement, come here and sit in the room and say, what about so-and-so case and the rest of it? And what the Chinese tend to do in the room is say, oh, right, you want to talk about that? And they burn up all the time that you had available for discussions in the room on that issue and punish you that way. Everything we know about Keir Starmer is that he's now boastfully calling himself all the time a British pragmatist. He doesn't want to go down that route. He wants to keep talking about the stuff, but he is willing to make that volume adjustment. And I think that's what he did in the room with President Xi and others today.
Now, the Chinese are also pointing at Trump and saying, we are the people who uphold the world order now. Where do we think Keir Starmer is on the world order and where it's going?
Well, we had an interview with Keir Starmer last week in Chequers and asked him exactly that. Where was he on the spectrum of leaders? If Mark Carney was out there in front and had actually more or less given up on the old world order, where was Keir Starmer? And you got the very strong impression that he was at the other end of that spectrum. He still desperately wants to cling hold to the idea that the special relationship with America and intelligence and defense and other areas, that will still be there after Donald Trump in a very recognizable form. But there are people already in Whitehall who are beginning the, apparently to them, rather terrifying work of looking into the crystal ball, imagining Britain without that relationship. And one of the things they quite often turn around and say is, my goodness, it'll take decades to unwind.
Gary Gibbon talking to me earlier. Now, President Xi described the world we live in as turbulent and fluid, but China's economy keeps on growing, trying to build its dominance in all the key technologies of the 21st century. So how does the UK negotiate that growing power? Here's our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi.
Let's look at the big picture, the race for global supremacy, with President Trump in the US on one side and countries like ours in the middle and President Xi on the other. Well, the US economy is still the world's biggest, raking in $28 trillion. You've got China coming in second at $18 trillion and the UK on sixth on less than $4 trillion. And the US remains the biggest spender when it comes to defence. But here is the hitch, because this $300 billion goes a long way in China. It's allowed President Xi to build up 234 warships, creating the world's biggest navy. China has been quite clear it wants to dominate the industrial world, especially in new technologies like AI and quantum computing, along with the clean energy and rare earths they need. And in many of these fields, like green energy and robotics, China is already ahead. And one of the statistics American tech bosses obsess over is how much money is being spent on research and development. And you can see how close China is to catching up. Out of 74 critical technologies where the US used to dominate, China has now taken the lead in 66 of them. In the real world, this shows up in the number of new inventions. Have a look at patent applications, virtually zero, and now suddenly China is on 1.8 million. That is a huge swing. Now, China's edge offers a lot of appeal, but it's a relationship that's brought vulnerabilities as well as opportunities. There have been a wave of Chinese investments in the UK, including one of the country's largest pub chains, a Premier League football club, and one of London's most recognisable skyscrapers. But the real money has been in critical infrastructure, nuclear, water, battery storage and clean energy. But that's also where there's been controversy. The 2020 decision to remove Chinese tech giant Huawei from our 5G mobile network at the behest of Americans revealed the challenge of looking to China for solutions. The man at the helm of Huawei UK at the time is one of Britain's leading industrialists, Sir Michael Rake, who says with calmer minds, security risks could have been managed.
This is one of the few, if not the only, occasions where a company has been willing to hand over its software for verification. So we were completely content with that, as were GCHQ, as were MI5, and it became politicized. The truth is that whilst this was going on, the alternatives were at that time not as good, more expensive, made in China with no security wrapper. It cost billions to the companies. And an independent economic survey showed it probably cost the economy, because of our loss of positioning in 5G, about £20 billion. You have to understand there are security risks in dealing with different countries. By the way, not just China. And I think people would be surprised if they knew the list of countries you have to be careful with. There's definitely an element of hysteria, an element of reds under the beds led by certain politicians. As Churchill famously said, jaw is better than war. And engagement between individuals to build trust is important.
The question is how much this visit has helped rebuild that trust.
Well, of course, it's the middle of the night here right now, just after 3 a.m. But earlier, I spoke to the founder of the think tank, the Centre for China and Globalisation, Henry Wang. It advises the Chinese government, and we began by discussing what China wants from the relationship with Britain.
In order to maintain multilateral system, in order to maintain the Second World War system not collapse, China and the UK has to work together. So I think in that sense, it's no longer China versus the West or West versus China. It's every country is based on their specific interests.
So it's a purely economic relationship, and the geopolitics of each side may be very different.
I think economic is certainly a big driver. Like Starmer said, I'm coming here for the benefit of the UK people now. But then geopolitically, we are facing huge challenges. We see that Donald Trump's second term now is really disrupt the world in a big way.
What does China think of the way Trump is essentially destroying the institutions of the post-war settlement?
I think Trump is doing whatever he thinks is right. He felt the MAGA is really his main objective, because American is spread too far, too thin, too wide for the last so many years. And now it's time to retreat and time to consolidate in the Western Hemisphere. That's why Europe is become a target, actually. Canada become a target, Greenland become a target, and Europe is a target. So in this situation, the world is falling apart.
Does China like the post-war world order?
Absolutely.
Of international institutions, of the United Nations?
Of course. China is the first signatory of UN Charter, and then China is the strongest defender and supporter of global system, of United Nations.
Aren't we in an era now where, whether it's Trump, Putin or Xi, these are regimes which can remove rivals, oppress minorities, and force their way into delivering what they want? Is there really a difference between...
No, I think there's a huge difference. I think what China does is totally different. For example, China has maintained a big solidarity and very united across the country. In the last 40-some years, China hasn't really started any war anywhere, and still largely a peaceful country. So,
although it might well in the next 2 years. There are lots of military exercises. There are Chinese flights going into Taiwanese airspace. There was a drone that overflew very recently. So there's clearly a militarized aspect to China's ambition with Taiwan.
I think priority for China is still to have a peaceful unification. And then this is a civil war hasn't finished since 1949.
What do you think is going on right now? Because we're seeing a procession now of European leaders coming to China to say, we want to do trade, we want to improve relationships.
We've seen 2026 is a landmark year of really a new paradigm shift, because there's an old narrative of China versus the West, or West versus China. It's gone, basically.
The assumption in Britain is that China is spying on us. And you know that there's been big controversy over the new embassy and to what extent it will be a spying base. What do you think of these criticisms?
They're all bashing on Huawei, saying Huawei has a monitoring device or something. Everybody is getting out of Huawei like UK did. But so far, we haven't had any smoking gun. We haven't had any hard evidence of Huawei did anything or have a backdoor somewhere. No, nobody can prove that. And same is true for the spy case that UK dropped lately. That calling there's a spy, but then they find not enough evidence either.
And how does China see what's happening in Iran now, with US forces right on the doorstep and threatening?
Every country sees that and all feel uneasy and threatened. The problem is that China doesn't like any country just go in and throw the bombs and attack a sovereign nation without any proper authorization of the Security Council of UN.
When you talk about the world order, it is clear that Donald Trump is withdrawing from many international organizations. He's pulling the US out of UN bodies. Does the world order work if the United States doesn't cooperate with it?
The thing is now, all the rest of countries, also including China, should stand up to support the current system that we all benefit for the last 80 years. We haven't had a third world war because we have this system.
Henry Wang, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, we commissioned an opinion poll to find out how people in Britain view this changing world order and its impact on the UK's relations with China, NATO, the US and EU. It found that trust in the NATO alliance has eroded, with just 5% of Britain certain the US would fulfil its Article 5 commitment to defend another NATO country if it was attacked. Almost 3 in 10 think the US would be unlikely to intervene. A similar number believe NATO is currently ineffective at protecting Europe. Only half think it is currently effective. And that drops to 39% who believe it will be effective in 30 years. The party leader most trusted to work with Donald Trump in Britain's best interest is Nigel Farage at 24%, followed by Keir Starmer, though 44% said they didn't know. 4 in 10 Britons think the UK should keep working closely with the US, especially Reform and Conservative supporters, while 3 in 10 think the UK should look for new allies and partnerships elsewhere, such as with China. 43% believe Britain would be safer if it rejoined the EU, while 22% think it is safer staying out. And similar numbers think the UK would be more prosperous if it rejoined or stayed out. So what are the fears that Europeans have about security in the New World Order, particularly when Russia and China seem to walk ever closer? And how is the UK's visit to China going down in Europe? EU foreign ministers have been meeting today in Brussels. Our Europe editor, Matt Fry, is there. Matt.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome to Brussels. The European Union used to consider itself one of the crowning achievements of the outgoing world order, a club of 27 nations united, in theory, by values, free trade and the scar tissue of history of 2 world wars. But never before has it been besieged by trade, security, war and superpower politics all at the same time. The famous Grand Place in Brussels probably gels with America's current view of Europe, quaint, picturesque and ineffectual. But if the post-World War II order, or indeed what they used to call the West, have a capital at all, it is this city, host to not just the EU, but also NATO headquarters. These institutions have rarely felt more under siege. from an aggressive Putin in Russia, from a ruthlessly pragmatic Xi in the East, and from an unpredictable, irritable Trump in the West. So today's monthly huddle of foreign ministers occurs with added urgency. It feels, to borrow from Hollywood, very one battle after another. Top of the agenda today, Iran. America is sending an armada, the EU is sending a statement.
We are putting new sanctions on the list, and I also expect that we agree on listing the Iran Revolutionary Guard on the terrorist list.
And then there's the strategic issue around Greenland and the Danes. Who do you fear more, mercurial, unpredictable, irritable Donald Trump, or a very calculating, pragmatic, and quite ruthless Xi Jinping?
I'm not in a position where I should fear anyone. I mean, the only reason why you should fear anyone is if you are not prepared to deal with challenges. And I think what we have received during the last year or so is a lot of wake-up calls. And I think last week Europe actually woke up.
My big headache is the fact that we are not focusing enough on the support to Ukraine and the stopping of the Russian war machine.
You've just joined NATO. Are you confident that Donald Trump would come to Sweden's help, or indeed the Baltic Republic's help, under Article 5 of the NATO Constitution, should Russia roll its tanks or fly its missiles into NATO territory?
We've been members now for almost 2 years, and we are very proud members of the alliance, and I am absolutely convinced that we are much more secure within the alliance than we were.
Do you trust
before.
the Americans?
And the answer is yes.
But many doubts linger. So we sat down with Poland's Deputy Prime Minister Radek Sikorski.
Well, there's certainly been an acceleration. The United States is setting new rules for its relationship with Europe. Politics continues.
What are these new rules? How would you define them?
The US wants to have a smaller footprint in Europe and says that it cannot maintain the same level of commitment both to Europe and to the Indo-Pacific while having a privileged position in its own hemisphere. This changes things.
Is Donald Trump driving Europe further into the arms of China?
I wouldn't say so. With China, we have a complex relationship. Collaborate where possible, compete where needed, confront where necessary. It's a more complex relationship than between the West and the Soviet Union. And of course, we know that China's actual ideology is making China great again.
So China is being made great again by Xi Jinping. Trump wants to make America great again. Who is making Europe great?
I think Europe is great already. And we are a place where there is rule of law.
But is the problem here that Donald Trump, has not only declared Europe a foe on occasion? I mean, it's not that it's a competitor, it's actually someone he's got its sights on. That is a new development, isn't it?
Look, Poland is of the mind that we should defend the transatlantic relationship. We will do our utmost to keep things from being derailed because we think that the partnership is still necessary for deterring Vladimir Putin's expansionist imperialist Russia.
So Mark Carney, before he gave a speech in Davos, stopped off in Beijing. Our Prime Minister is currently in Beijing. Clearly people are shopping around for alliances. What would you say to your British friends when it comes to looking for a new role for Britain in the new world disorder?
I would say Farage performed a con on you. The benefits of Brexit have not materialized. It was a mistake. Come back to the fold. Be a good European.
Just one final one on Trump. Is it a problem for Europe that the crisis that Trump poses is not strong enough for Europe to truly concentrate on standing alone?
President Trump was right during his first term to call on Europe, particularly Western Europe, to spend more on defense. We've doubled our spending since then. We're back in the real world where resources and financial and military power matter. And so Europe should become a proper actor on the international scene.
And is it doing that?
Not fast enough.
Is nostalgia a policy or just a wishful thinking?
It's not nostalgia. It is several decades of sunk trust and mutually beneficial relationship with the United States. And so we are clinging on to something that was that gave us peace, gave us prosperity, and that we are sorry to say goodbye to.
So, Deputy Prime Minister, we've done an exclusive Channel 4 News poll that indicates that just 5% of Britons actually trust Donald Trump to come to Europe's rescue should Article 5 have to be invoked.
Article 5 does not legally oblige you to go to war. Of course, that's what we all hope would happen.
But the fact that so few Britons still trust in the Americans' trust in Article 5, that surely must give you cause for alarm.
Well, so much for your special relationship.
Radek Sikorski, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I might as well have said, ouch. One of the problems here is not so much the threat from China, especially when it comes to dumping goods on the European single market, or indeed the unreliability of Donald Trump, which they've really felt at close quarters here, but also internally inside Europe. Remember, there are parties in France, in Italy already in power, but also in Germany, that could corrode the European Union from inside. That would really significantly weaken this body here. So that's something else, an internal front they have to keep their eyes on in this new world disorder. Back to you, Krish, in Beijing.
Thanks, Matt. So from Europe, or what Donald Trump described as a decaying group of countries with weak leaders, to the United States. The president's words and actions over the last year, from tariffs to trashing climate change science and renewable energy initiatives to seizing Venezuela's president and claiming Greenland, have drawn criticism from long-standing allies who now seem to be warming to China instead. Our US editor, Anushka Astana, reports.
From this Trump administration, one message began ringing out from the start.
The European Union's it was formed in order to screw the United States. I mean, look, let's be honest.
A message carried from Washington, D.C. to Munich with an attack on ideology.
In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
The claim in Brussels was that Europe had been taking advantage on defence.
President Trump will not allow anyone to turn Uncle Sam into Uncle Sucker.
And then came this doubling down in Davos.
Certain places in Europe are not even recognizable, frankly, anymore. They're not recognizable. And we can argue about it, but there's no argument.
A World Economic Forum speech in which Trump derided European free riders, called climate change the greatest hoax in history, and said the US was done subsidising the world. No sooner had he finished than one of America's biggest newspapers, the New York Times, declared China wins, as Trump cedes leadership of the global economy. It certainly does feel as if the tectonic plates of global power are shifting, as Starmer follows Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney in taking China's hand this month, with the German Chancellor preparing a trip in February. How bad have things got that European leaders, a Canadian leader, are turning to China as if it's more trustworthy than the United States?
I think there's a lot of shock going on the European side and a lot of the U.S. allies. This is a change in the way business has been conducted in the last several decades. So I think that there is an instinct, one, to show disbelief, and second, to say, how do we create leverage to show the United States that we have other options too. But moving past the flirtation is in no one's interest. It's not in the American interest, and it's certainly not in the European or Canadian interest.
These flirtations come despite China's dire human rights record. So how has Trump responded? With the threat of tariffs, of course. 100% if Ottawa strikes a free trade deal with Beijing.
When we antagonize our allies and partners, and when we send Canada to do a trade deal with China instead of coming to New Hampshire or the United States, it weakens our ability to confront our adversaries.
Yeah, but our allies have to be two things. They have to be willing to step up, but they also have to be capable of stepping up. And frankly, many of them have not.
Trump deals in strength and power, not just in economics but security, seizing Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro and now telling Iran time is running out as he sends an armada to the Gulf. Then there is the vast Arctic territory of Greenland, which Donald Trump wants to control in part to counter China, but where his aggressive stance may have pushed allies into its arms.
China, China, China.
Trump's obsession with China, both in this presidency and the last, has become fodder for comedians.
China, 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 China.
But in this global power struggle, the voices of concern are getting louder.
China, China, China.
As the world order shifts, and many fear China could have the last laugh. You heard me in that piece speak to Leyland Miller, who was appointed by Republicans onto a commission looking at the US-China relationship. And I put to him that there is some irony in the actions we've seen from Donald Trump, particularly over Greenland, an aggressive stance that has arguably pushed traditional allies towards the east, towards China. And look, he said, yes, there is a risk that Greenland spirals out of control, and it's not necessary because America can get whatever it wants in Greenland without alienating allies. But he was unapologetic about the fact that there has been a disruption in the relationship between the US and Europe more broadly, arguing that there was a need to try to get Europe to spend more, for example, on defence. They see that as a huge success here. Now, that said, there are concerns that Europe is moving towards China, and they want to persuade European countries that they will not get the same depth of relationship, either on economics or on security, with China that they already have with the United States.
Anushka Astana in Washington. Well, China is not only an economic superpower, it's making rapid strides in advanced technology like AI and robotics. How could Britain benefit from closer ties on tech, and what risks could it bring? Here's our international editor, Lindsay Hilson.
Artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, robotics, quantum computing. China is on the way to becoming a high-tech superpower, already catching up with the US in some areas. So should Britain, like Canada, be hedging its bets and looking east?
To be honest, at the moment, I'm not sure whether the UK government really has a China strategy, especially in the tech sector, because, presumably the concern over national security and data sovereignty is still there. And if the UK were able to sort of distance itself from this kind of the towing the US line, as always, and then think from their perspective, what is UK's national interest? What is the kind of, what Mark Carney called the principled but also pragmatic approach?
Is that possible?
To wake up the AI assistant, please say, hi, Rocket. Hi, Rocket.
On a recent trip to Hangzhou, I asked the founder of an AI-enabled glasses startup whether they could be used James Bond style for spying.
Country like in the UK, you have to leave the data. You cannot touch the user privacy stuff. So we just follow that laws.
We live in a world of exponential technological progress.
But the former CEO of Imagination, a British microprocessor company, says Britain should be wary. He says when he travelled to China in 2019 to meet what he thought was simply investors, they asked him to transfer all the technical know-how from British to Chinese engineers.
What I was concerned about, the technology and the knowledge of the technology being transferred to China, and these companies are all associated with the Chinese military. So one must conclude that it's being used in the Chinese military. So that's the problem. And the world should be very scared.
Imagination says it has always complied with applicable export and trade compliance laws in respect of its commercial licensing of semiconductor IP technology and related transactions. In the Chinese city of Shenzhen, you drive your electric car to the battery swapping station. It takes less than 3 minutes. There is plenty the UK can learn from Chinese innovation, especially in green tech, and many think the emphasis on security is overdone.
I just don't think that kind of attitude is very helpful. And I think it's also becoming more, it's really just taking an ideological position rather than being evidence-based and pragmatic, and think about what are the areas that, collaboration is still possible.
Drones are a dual-use technology. You can make a beautiful display or arm them to drop high explosives. The question now is whether fear and suspicion will curtail collaboration with China on tech, leaving Britain dependent on the US with its tariffs and resistance to regulation, watching China reach for the skies.
Well, let's hear now from the retired US Army General David Petraeus. He was also the head of the CIA under President Obama, and he joins us now from Palm Springs. Thank you for joining us. Now, I spoke to a very senior member of the British delegation a few hours ago who was telling me that Britain is very comfortable because the security services have established the areas it needs to keep China out of. China accepts that, and so they're not really concerned about security risks. Are they being naive?
I'm not sure about naive, but I think they're a bit incautious with that kind of rhetoric, although I suspect, knowing the British intelligence services exceedingly well, that they are taking every mitigating measure they possibly can to reduce the potential vulnerabilities that are absolutely in existence. Let's keep in mind that there's been enormous hacking from China over the years in an attempt to vacuum up every bit of data possible, and every country has been subject to that, and a number of other measures that they have pursued, again, to gain intelligence.
What do you think the actual threat is?
Oh, I think it's very, very substantial. Again, intellectual property has been another target over the years. It was striking how similar one of the Chinese fighter planes was to the F-35 until we learned that they'd actually stolen the plans for the F-35. So again, the threat is very, very significant, but a number of countries are engaged in that kind of activity, and you've just got to be coldly realistic about it.
We're trying to assess tonight the extent to which the world order is being rewritten. I mean, what has happened when China is the one telling Britain, we believe in the world order, we pay our bills on time, we do international aid, we can be trusted. And it's the Americans who are threatening Britain with trade wars, threatening our military alliances, making territorial claims, and destabilising the whole relationship.
Well, I think part of that is accurate. I would just point out that the kind of world order that China is interested in achieving really is one that makes the world safe for their form of government. And traditionally, the US and the UK and our other allies have sought to make the world safe for democracy and free market capitalism. Obviously, there's a somewhat different approach in Washington, although I'd be cautious about overstating that as well. There's constantly reversion to the mean, and frankly, Congress, if you look at the actual spending bills, and that's where the policy often really resides, is not just what's rhetorically said, but also what is in the actual laws and the appropriations bills that enable the authorizations. They are still very strongly reflective of the kind of appreciation for the fact that U.S. leadership in the world does matter, and that we get a great deal out of the alliances, especially, frankly, now with respect to NATO, thanks to President Trump, by the way, and also Vladimir Putin, that European countries are spending a great deal more on their own defense than they did in the past, as we, in a way, carried them on our shoulders.
But there's little doubt, is there, that when it comes to the post-war international institutions, it is the US that is undermining them, withdrawing the US from many of the UN's bodies, World Health Organization and so on, and going to the UN and basically trashing it. So there's a difference between US leadership and US leadership within the post-war world order.
Yeah, look, I am, again, one who very strongly subscribes to the notion that that U.S. leadership is important. Obviously, our political leaders right now are less persuaded of that. But when you actually look at what's going on the ground, I think you still see very active participation in, and in many cases, leadership of the international organizations that matter the most. Certainly, there are many with deficiencies. We withdrew from some of these. There's a lot of obscure ones that, as I read that list, didn't even recognize, much less see any reason to be part of them. But no, this is a different approach. Again, a lot of us would like to see something a bit more traditional, but this will evolve in the United States as well.
General Petraeus, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Donald Trump has certainly changed US relations with many of its allies, and we are here in Beijing along with Sir Keir Starmer, who's on a charm offensive to reset the UK's relations with China that have been riven by differences over spying scandals and geopolitical alliances. Now, it is almost 4 a.m. here in China, and heroically, I must say, I am joined by Zichen Wang, who is the founder and editor of the English language politics and business newsletter Pekingnology, which is quite hard to say at this time of the night. Why does China care about Britain? I mean, after all, the amount of trade is not really that big for China.
Well, thank you for having me. At first, I think the United Kingdom is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. It is, for a very long time in the Chinese understanding of the world, the second largest power in the world with a lot of history. It is still very relevant in today's world, and it is in a very special place for China.
Now, the Brits have been utterly charmed. They went into their meeting with President Xi, and he chatted about football and Dickens and their cock a hoop. I mean, has he just kind of worked out how to keep, how to sweeten them up?
Well, I'm sure this is a historic visit. I think he personally used that word. He is the first prime minister to visit China after 8 long years. And he met President Xi, he met Chinese Premier Li, and the businesses have a lot of agreements. And from the press reports I've read so far, a lot of concrete results. Yes, I think so far it's very successful.
Do you feel China has essentially won its international campaign over many, many years to say to countries like Britain, don't lecture us about democracy and human rights, let's just talk money? And that's essentially what's happening now.
Well, I think one can look at the world, look at the international landscape from very different angles. And at this very particular moment, we are seeing a lot of changes in the world. A lot of countries are trying to, let's say, de-risk themselves from the United States. And China is the second largest economy in the world, offering a lot of market opportunities and technology. And there are many more common benefits. And of course, there are also differences. So I think it's a great time to look for opportunities for cooperation and preserving the differences between the two countries.
How keen is China to spend money in Britain, though, and to own intellectual property and businesses in Britain?
I think if there is a welcoming political environment, atmosphere, regulations, many Chinese companies are very interested because, the UK is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's, although China is much larger in size, but the consumption power is huge, and it has this certain sort of privilege and prestige that in Chinese imaginations.
And just briefly, I mean, there's a small group of politicians in Britain who are sanctioned. Do you think China might drop that as part of this?
As far as I can tell, I think a few of them were sanctioned together with members of European Parliament a few years ago, and some of them have been, the sanctions on the European members of Parliament have been withdrawn.
So this might happen too. Zichen Wang, thank you very much indeed for joining us, for staying up.